Hello again, everybody. This is Buxton. Lawrence welcoming you to this interview. And I'm pleased this evening to welcome Dylan. It's just about 8 p.m. my time and about 3 p.m. his time on the other side of the big pond. And he's also known as the record spinner. Now, as you can probably imagine, he's into his vinyl in particular and his records of like rock music generally. You can see the incredible collection behind him there. Almost makes me jealous of my rather more austere background, I'm afraid. And he basically looked at box sets pertaining to vinyl and picture discs. Looked at the large collection of classical artists such as David Bowie, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the White Stripes, and Kiss, who might get this sneaking feeling maybe your absolute favourite. Would that be? Yeah.
Kiss is definitely the. You know what? It's very funny. Kiss is my number one, but my foundation of what I grew up with is indeed like progressive rock as well as just classic rock in general. But Kiss kind of merges
Yeah.
up in the classic rock vein. But it's funny how like I'm known as the Kiss guy, but yet this opportunity is going to be focusing on another kind of avenue of my taste. So it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, Kiss is one of those bands that I think people that don't know that they know them do know them, and the sheer sales and the sheer largeness of the personalities, particularly Gene Simmons,
Of
always
course.
made sure that everybody kind of got that understanding and such a strong stage image. So today, though, we're going to talk, as Dylan says, about progressive rock, and it's one of these things that, having got into it as we both did young, it's the challenge, I think, is to explain to people how it's different from ordinary rock, from your sort of your hard rockers, just your Kisses and your blues rockers like the Stones, and the sort of names that are slightly more familiar to people. And so, how would you describe how it's different from the rock that's more familiar to people from the classic era?
It's a very good question, and it can go in a million different directions. But I think to keep it as concise and to the point, the aim of progressive rock compared to classic rock or blue, whatever, is to break all the rules and push all the boundaries. Plain and simple. And that could be anything, whether it's instrumentation, arrangement, structures, anything about it. It just kind of takes that leap forward from the confinements of just the standard formula of all the classics and such, and to kind of go into uncharted territory where it is perhaps more adventurous.
Yeah, I think that's
Simple.
very succinct and very accurate. I always think one of the things is it's not only doesn't care if it's not fashionable, it almost goes out of its way to reject everything. So although people say, "Oh, it's pretentious, oh, it's dated, blah 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 blah," how can it date when it's kind of dateless?
Yeah.
If you know what I mean, it kind of if it's being created now, it's no necessarily different in that regard than if it was stuff that was coming out in the sort of early 70s or something. Um, yeah. So the second question I was going to ask: do you think that progressive rock was treated quite harshly by the critics, even in its heyday, which we're basically saying was the early 70s in particular?
That is a very good question. Unfortunately, I did not live in the time frame where you had things like Melody Maker or such to
Hmm.
to see firsthand like what people's take on this genre was. I think, and maybe just to kind of point the direction, sort of. I mean, I would agree that King Crimson was probably the first true progressive rock band. I mean, yeah, the Beatles were
Yeah.
kind of fleshing things out in the studio. You had Sergeant Pepper and things like that, and then the Moody Blues kind of chimed in, Procol Harum. But
Yeah.
when you have something like, let's say, King Crimson come onto the fold, and just to kind of like you had mentioned with the Stones, like when they opened for them at Hyde Park in '69, they were dubbed the band of the day. And I think that impact, sure, maybe left a very good mark. And then everything else that came after, whether let's say it was Yes or Genesis or anyone else in that sort of vein was like a basis of sort of, I guess, comparison or judgment. Needless to say, in terms of what critics think, I mean, in my personal opinion, I feel like it's almost hypocritical for me to say this because I am a music journalist to a small degree. Um, it's, music is a people's game. Who cares what Lester Bangs or whoever has to say about it? If the fans buy it at the record shops, then that's the leg that it has to stand on, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And they did buy it, and something like Genesis, they probably sold more when Phil Collins became the front man of the band, but they made the reputation initially in the early 70s when Peter Gabriel was dressing up as all sorts of weird and wonderful characters on stage, and it was kind of. I say to people, you've got to have an open mind, because I mean, I went to a festival 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I just went to another gig actually a couple of days ago, and I was chatting with some of the bands, and even some of the ones who are in groups themselves, which are quite adventurous on stage or on record. Say, well, half the fun of it is you don't know even what the other bands are going to be doing, because I mean you've got ones that are stopping a song halfway through, and like little lady dresses up as a pixie comes out and serves a cup of tea mid song, or you've got people coming on stage wearing sort of what looks like half a forest, and
Interesting.
it's I think if you've got a sense of the theatrical, and you can appreciate it for being a mix of all different things. A lot of them, some of them from the rock world, some of them completely not, so literary or theatrical, as I say, as well as the stuff that scares people off, like the sort of the flute solos and the 20-minute closing numbers and the mystical lyrics that a lot of people need to have like several runs at. Easy. But when did you get into it then? I mean, did you sort of, do you feel that you adapted to it because you got into it pretty early? Did you think that was a vital thing, or do you think you could have got around it and enjoyed it?
I think it was 100% from my upbringing when I was a child. I mean, it goes without saying that like the holy trinity of sorts, it's Rush, Yes, and Genesis between both my parents. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, I mean, and it's funny because you know how they say like with Rush, like it's a male dominated fan base. My mother has seen them 50 plus times since Hemispheres, so
Wow.
that goes to show something. But Genesis, like for me, like if I had to take my pick on, I mean that's kind of a tough thing because for me, I have such a closeness with Genesis to the point where like my mom had all of the Armando Gallo books that he had put out around like the early 80s and such, and I would just flip through and I would see like photos of Peter Gabriel wearing the flower head dress and the red dress from the Foxtrot album cover, or dressed up as Rail with a leather jacket. Like that kind of opened me up entirely. And I guess you know what, in some small degree, that whole thing lends itself to with my love for Kiss. They dress up with the makeup and the
Yeah.
costumes, so I guess it goes to show that perhaps I was always seeking out something that seeped beyond just three dudes in street clothes playing
Jeans. Yeah.
three chords and an attitude, essentially. But yeah, definitely, it's a major part of my musical upbringing as a kid, and even as I got older, like bands like Pink Floyd and King Crimson, I kind of gravitated to more in terms of embracing their entire discography. Like for me, it wasn't just In the Court and that was it. Like I kind of got into Red on my own, Lark's Tongues, all the Adrian Belew
Yeah.
80s stuff. And then with Floyd, I am an advocate for the pre-Dark Side era. Like I adore Piper the Gates of Dawn. I love metal. I love Adam Hart Mother. Like that's all stuff that I approached on my own. And then from there I kind of got into other obscure, prog stuff like, Focus and Camel. Not that they're obscure, but like from that little step I kind of was able to make that other reach and dig into other stuff. So I feel like for as much as the classics influenced me then as a kid, a lot of the newer, more obscure stuff is what I'm discovering, now.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually the question I was going to come to, is sort of which ones of the classic era were you the big fans of? So you say, yeah, obviously Rush and Pink Floyd and a bit of say Genesis, which is a lot of people, a lot of people will understand that. I think Floyd and King Crimson were my first two
That's
bands,
awesome.
and Rush actually only a bit more recently, really, because I always I was always trying to place them, partly because there's always this sort of feeling that the progressive rock is a European thing. Now, Rush certainly challenged that. Then you've got American bands which are lesser well known, like Pavlov's Dog, which I've got quite a soft spot for, with the
Okay.
extraordinary lead singer. That voice is just I don't know how he did what he did with it.
What are they called again?
Pavlov's Dog, with the David Surkamp singer. I think it would send dogs from the room. His voice gets so high. This is what I mean. They're probably not one of the most well known, but if you hear them, you're not going to forget them. Yeah. I mean, they did a few albums in the 70s, but then he's carried on since, I believe. Worth checking out. They'll certainly make an impact on you, because you think Geddy Lee's voice goes high, then David Surkamp's is it would smash wine glasses, I think,
Oh, you know what, though? I get where you come from, though, in terms of like with getting into Rush and where they fit on the prog spectrum, because like if you look at like the very early stuff, it's just it's Canadian Zeppelin. Let's just face
it. Yeah.
And then
I quite like that first album as well.
What's that?
I was just saying, my brother's a big Led Zeppelin fan, and
I love Zeppelin.
Yeah, you love them too, yeah. And the first album, it is, there's a bit of Black Sabbath in there, there's a bit of Deep Purple in there, but it's very
it's very much a melting pot of that English hard rock stuff that was going on in the late 60s, early 70s. And then obviously the fully fleshed out prog era, I guess, was, of course, the 70s. And then they merged into the whole sort of new wavy kind of thing in the 80s with the synths. And then 90s forward, just, they kind of refined that power trio kind of thing. I feel like there's still very much that element of prog that's in there, that's always seeped in, but yet there's still that major hard rock emphasis that I think the let's say maybe the non-progger could really appreciate. Maybe
one of the odd things about progressive rock bands, a little bit like, whilst they're not prog, Fleetwood Mac had such a weird history that it's amazing to think what they went from and what they went to. I mean, both were kind of successful, but all the turmoil in the middle. And then with bands like Pink Floyd lost, as I think I said on one of my other videos, obviously lost their frontman Sid Barrett, who was the creative force, and then went through a sort of a weird period where they had to readjust and completely created something new. And Rush again, the original drummer was the lyricist, but he wasn't very well, unfortunately. I mean, he had diabetes, possibly.
Diabetes, yes.
Yeah, and they just happened to get Neil Morse in as a replacement, who was not only sorry. I think, you would know better than me. So who's the drummer?
Neil Peart.
Peart, that's it. Not
yes.
Neil
Morse is a whole other different animal.
yes, but there is a Neil Morse. But Peart is not only an incredible drummer, obviously one of the best, but he wrote all the lyrics, which is quite unusual for a band, and I think a lot of progressive bands have that, or Genesis with the changes they went through. Right. My next question, as I said, I've been to lots of progressive rock festivals this year myself, and seen some very interesting new acts, such as the nearly entirely female Ebb, and the folky Sprig and Mist. What new artists would you recommend, and what's the prog scene like on your side of the big pond?
Ooh, that is a very good question. It's funny. When it comes to newer prog, I will say this is a name that's been kind of making some waves as of lately. There is a band called Crownlands. That it's basically a duo. But if you want like 2112, Farewell to King's Hemispheres era Rush, you listen to Crownlands. There is such a distinctive influence there. And you know what? It's funny. Like a lot of the newer prog bands, like some of the ones that you had mentioned, and obviously the publication is, it's native in your neck of the woods. for me, if I come through a copy of Prog magazine at like a Barnes and Noble, and here in the States, that's kind of how I'm in the know. Um, but I still think very much that despite some of the American offshoots, there have been even like bands like Kansas, and dare I say, maybe sticks to a small degree. I think progressive rock has and always will be property of the United Kingdom. So, I'm still learning some of the newer ones that exist out there. When I give them a listen, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I always, my ears are always open.
Yeah, some interesting ones in places like Italy have still got some, both in Italian and English language bands. Sort of Aric names. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but they've got a nice body of work from sort of the 2000s.
Interesting.
Car Mechanic, obviously the Flower Kings in Scandinavia.
Yeah, Flower Kings are great.
Yeah, then you've got that sort of. They all seem to. If they do get spare time, they either do solo records or they form super groups just to do even more. So you've almost.
Obvious one is Transatlantic.
Yeah. Oh yes, I got one of those the other day, and it's just. It was the one I got. I think was originally going to be one track, which is about 80-something minutes long. Or
oh, good lord! That's as prog as it gets.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't have it any other way. So my last question is, as I briefly mentioned before, I just come back from Birmingham, where I saw Nick Mason's Source of Full of Secrets
How was it?
gig. Or you've seen it yourself, because they did go to America.
So I think he toured America twice.
Yeah.
First time around, I think it was when he first started the band. He played on April 20th in Philadelphia. That's like the city closest to me. And because it was April 20th, Philadelphia was it was interesting to say the least. But for me, like seeing a band like that is a dream come true. Because like I said, I am a Dark Side advocate. I mean, I love Dark Side, The Wall, Animals, whatever, but like that early period where, like you were saying, they kind of had to find their feet, that is where some of their most interesting stuff is, because they were doing film soundtracks. They did avant-garde experiments. They worked with an orchestra. They did these sidelong epics. Like, it was amazing. But I only managed to see Nick Mason once, and it was absolutely tremendous. Where else am I going to hear Vegetable Man? Let's be honest.
Yes, I think they may have been changing the set list quite a lot, because I think the running order you would have heard was different to the one that I believe I heard.
Most likely. Did he play Echoes this time around?
Oh yeah. Well, they finished the. Did they do it when you?
No, basically the set that I saw is essentially the Live at the Roundhouse release. Like that was the set that I saw. So I know that he was tinkering the set list. I think he threw in some newer other songs. So, but no, that's awesome though that you got to see him. That's tremendous.
Yeah, it's a pretty decent light show and backdrop. I mean, it impresses me even when I go to a festival, and sometimes they're smaller, lesser known acts, but not certainly not in terms of talent, but audience and demographic and things. But the people who do the sound mixing and the backdrops and that do a great job. My question was going to be, when I go to gigs like that, and particularly the one I went to a few, say 2 or 3 weeks back. Brilliant festival. But the one thing one of the many things that gets thrown at progressive rock over the years, as probably as much now as ever before, is it tends to appeal, perhaps even more these days than, say, something like country and western, to a very specific demographic, which is mostly white guys with white beards in leather jackets, and sometimes have their families with them, which is what I do tend to kind of see. When I went to Birmingham, I mean, there was that was quite a lot of the audience, and then, as I say, sometimes you've got the children there who could be sort of 18, 19, and quite a lot of daughters going along. And whilst I've noticed that female representation is being praised for now, perhaps becoming a little bit more obvious in progressive rock, and there's a lot of bands out there with female front people, and like I say, a band like Ebb that are doing their own thing, which is nearly an all-female band. How do you think progressive rock, to avoid ending up one day as perhaps being too niche can attract a generally younger audience in these times of quite a short attention spans potentially?
That's a very good question, and you're absolutely right. I feel like, and it's interesting because even like because I work at a record store, I encounter several individuals, even in my age bracket. I'm only in my mid 20s, that do have an appreciation for that kind of music, and I just think it's in terms of like where they get it from, very much could be an upbringing type thing, because like you said, with some of these prog festivals, it's usually guys in white beards and they drag the wives around and the kids, and that's that. It's dad's night out. But I feel like it kind of is simply just passing the torch down, which I think in turn is what a lot of these newer prog bands kind of tap into the past a little bit in terms of the obvious influence, and kind of keep the flag flying. Hell, even for some of, I guess, the elder statesmen of prog. Obviously, one of my favorites is Steve Hackett of Genesis. He's put out several records in the last, I want to say, what, 10 plus years. I mean, he's been active all throughout. I don't know. I always get a kick when I see, people in my age group, getting into the kind of music, just because it's like, I don't know. Rick Wakeman said it once in a documentary where, like, when punk exploded, you would go to the record store and, they would slide the prog records in a brown paper bag. It was like a dirty word. But now I feel like it's been embraced. Even just to circle back around with the journalists and such that you mentioned, for example, Rush, they were never a critics band, but yet on their last legs, they're on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. So go figure. It maybe becomes in fashion with time. I don't know.
I think what happens is with everything, and prog, I think more than anything in the music world, is it almost had the backlash before it had even had its heyday. So it's almost, yeah, as you say, when punk had been and gone, perhaps people thought, well, maybe that was the fad. And there's some very good punk bands out there. There's bands like the Stranglers, which are a bit of both, a bit of punk and a bit of prog in a strange way.
Stranglers are cool.
Yeah, very very good musicians, and does some great work as well ahead of its time. But yeah, it's as people say about progressive rock. I mean, the people that would criticise it for saying that it has its funny ways that we went into earlier. Then there's people saying, well, it needs to do something new. But then from what I see, it is, because I think it is attracting, as I say, there's new approaches. I've seen bands which have got older members in them, have attracted suddenly like lots of young female singers have come into the band and set it in a completely different direction. And as you were saying before in your first answer, very, as I say, very, very aptly, it's prepared to do something different, so it can't. I don't think it can ever stagnate. I mean, if you go on, let's say, YouTube, and you just go through all the new bands out there for progressive rock, maybe because it's sort of making it with a home studio these days are probably a little bit more, a little bit less cumbersome than in the old days. I think there's just a huge selection out there, and it was just difficult to get your head around all of it. It's not impossible, but it's good to hear your experiences, say as a family. Are very encouraging to hear that it crosses both the generational divide, to the Rush fan, and also the gender divide, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because you often think about it. Sure, like when you think of prog, it's back then it was what, men in flannel shirts. Now it's old men with white beards. I mean, maybe like the female demographic, I like to think it existed to whichever percentage that it was back then. But even like now, like when I see Steve Hackett live and some of the other, like, even like, yes, I feel that it's, I don't want to say 50-50, but it's it levels out. I think, which is great to see. And like you were saying, like, I'm even curious on that all female band that you've mentioned a couple times. I personally, I haven't heard much about them, so I got to listen to that for myself. So it's cool to see that representation there. It's awesome.
Yes, I think basically it's a very interesting backstory to the band, because I think the creative force, I think the main lady's American, but a lot of the band are Scottish. So you've got a very, again, it's what makes it unique is the mixture of different things that you don't tend to get. I've just thought of one more final quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you work in the record store.
Yes.
Which are the classic records that you get the most requests for, and which prog one?
Oh, all right. I'm gonna say this right now, and this is probably a major slap in Prog's face, but in terms of what like sells the best, Taylor Swift pays our rent.
Yeah, yes,
I
I
have
like
to say that
that.
there's that. One. There's one act in particular. Her name is Chapel Roan. She has been selling very, very well. She's like been exploding out of lately. So those are like the two big ones. But the shop that I'm at, which is called Sky Valley Records, it's in Somerdale, New Jersey, just right outside of Philadelphia. Um, we specialize in a little bit of everything, but we do have a good pocket of people that are into old school progressive rock. So things like Jethro Tull and Yes and Genesis, and even like a lot of the hard rock stuff like Deep Purple, Sabbath, Iron Maiden. Like we kind of have a little bit of pocket there, but we kind of expand into everywhere else. So luckily, it's fans of those bands that kind of have that leverage to where it battles out with all the other pop stuff that's going on out there.
Yes, well, yes, I imagine in a few decades' time, someone will be doing an interview saying, God, why aren't people buying the old, classic Taylor Swift records? And there'll be something that we can't even imagine at the moment. Maybe they'll all come full circle.
But what's funny though? I think about it sometimes, like, because I don't know how it is at like for us, like we have thrift shops, but in your neck of the woods, it's what like charity shops. I wonder what records right now coming out are going to find themselves in bargain bins in about 30, 40 years time. That's one thing I'm curious about. And it makes me interested to live and experience that being in my age. So I guess we'll see.
You get bands like Oasis, who seem to get to number one, and the records would always be in the bargain bins because it just seemed like once the absolutely massive explosion of hype and interest was over, and I say that I think the first record in particular was great, and it really it had something positive and anthemic to it, which everybody needed. It was like a new scene that was starting.
Yeah.
But somehow there was sort of the coolest and the uncoolest band in the world at the same time. So you'd find them, as I say, selling out in what was then you say the mainstream record
Sure.
stores, and then also being in the bargain basement because people would say, no, I prefer the first one. No, they've had their day, but then it would still get to number one. So it's a funny old world, isn't it?
I kind of sense that here in the States, like in terms of what I typically see regularly at most like, Goodwills or Salvation Armies are a lot of like 90s alternative like rock albums that very much came after Nirvana's Nevermind basically broke out. I see that as like that's the big moment. And then you had bands like Live and Collective Soul and Bush, like all those bands, put out, records that sold millions, but it's Goodwill Gold. As I like to call it.
Were Bush, were they the British band that seemed to do far better in America than they did in the homeland? Is that the one I'm thinking of? Yeah.
I'm trying to think. They might be American. I think there's one album called 16 Stone. It could be English with an album name like that. I really am not sure. But like a lot of bands in that sort of vein, like that came after the wake of Nirvana, they tend to find themselves in the Goodwill shop, similar to like you said with Oasis. It's funny, I never see any Oasis albums in the bargain sections of any shops I'm at. So that's an interesting contrast between the States and the UK. I'm curious about that now.
Yeah, one of those bands really that everybody felt was just going to be like the sort of Rolling Stones, really, and sort of literally just keep putting a record out, selling stacks of it, but basically selling it sort of to get people to a tour and then sort of just being perpetually together. But
yeah,
the Gallagher brothers were always going to be a little bit too volatile for that offence.
Listen,
Thank you very much.
Anytime I see a new article on those two, I'm like, oh, what are they spatting about now? It's like, come on now, just bank on the anniversaries, just get back together, collect the paycheck, bam, you're fine.
I know. I mean, them and the Davis brothers in the Kings. I mean, God, I can't imagine
That's another
the other
one.
two as
Yeah.
well.
Maybe that's a sign. Brothers should not work together. I don't know.
Yeah, probably think that's a good idea. Thank you very much.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
Dylan, for that. And I'll put a link to your own page on this video. And please like and subscribe. And see you soon.
Bye bye.